particular aspect of being black and opening that to that possibility of being socially conscious, which means evolving and embracing the consciousness of the American that we wanted, that we needed. So therefore, it had not, although it started from the specifics of our culture, it was by no means parochial by any means. The forward goes on to say, we do not exist for those seemingly selective perennial and bestsellers and literary spokesmen of the race situation who are currently popular in the commercial press and slick in-group journals. Which it's wonderful, broadside against what was going on. I think that one of the penning of this was, I think, done in part by Calvin, who had some very interesting things to say about race, about culture, about sex. And later came to come out his work, sex and racism. Let me go on. There are unpublished and infrequently published ethnic writers whose works are excellent and important, and often far superior to those adopted view, which the standard press habitually and expediently affords the public. Okay? You can hear the sound, the edge. There's a kind of quality of youth and energy, naivete, but at the same time, the beginning of an important ideological position that's being formulated. Umbra exists to promote the vehicle of those outspoken and youthful writers who present aspects of social and racial reality which may be called uncommercial, unpalatable, unpopular, unwanted, but cannot with any honesty be considered non-essential to the whole and the healing of society. So that in addition to presenting the specifics of black culture, there was an attempt and an effort, a genuine effort made to present the historical situation of African Americans in the human context, its art, its culture, its forces, in an arena which everyone tried to narrow it out. So that in essence, Umbra had within it all of the elements of a diasporic literature, and at the same time, it had the force and energy of people coming together from different classes, different places, and that was something unique. Not only that, but there were white members of Umbra, so that therefore you had, on a very realistic level, an integration of not only this cultural place, which is called the Lower East Side historically, where people moved in and out, but you had a place where people who were black and people who were white could talk about things that were black. And in talking about them, they created a forum that provided an important focus for the writing that was to come out of the 60s. The writings which were cultural and nationalistic, the writings which I would probably call integrationist, but writings which avoided the strife exiles from middle class situations, upper middle class situations, from lumpen situations, like myself, exiled from the projects. And we found that there was something that we had to talk about. Now, I think when Tom and Patterson, Raymond Patterson, because there were other Pattersons to come, and Lloyd Addison, when they talked about the possibility of putting together a magazine or a workshop, there was a need. Tom, in some interviews, Tom Denton talks about how in talking to Raymond Patterson, the Patterson put him in contact with Calvin Hearn. And these were guys from David, Calvin from David, you were a friend of Calvin, so therefore so that's how and I found out about David from a friend of mine came up to my house. I was living above the place which they call Slugs at the time, and there was a woman, I don't know if you remember, Joyce Burke, and Emerson Washington. It was like the ideal couple. And she said, Joseph, there's a young guy down there living in your area that you should know. His name is David Henderson. He writes poetry and he's very, very good. She's from the Bronx, Joyce Burke. She was a very, clean, middle-class lady, went to Hunter College. Her parents had aspirations for her to become a teacher. And then she met a friend of mine named Emerson Washington. But he didn't lead her to Emerson Washington. And they gave him the highest possible reviews. So I said, I gotta meet this guy. And then, of course, it all came together. I mean, that meeting which we had, I think it was right across the street, 242 East 2nd or something like that, where Tom, the first meeting, you were there, Tom, Calvin, I think maybe Lloyd Addison was there, and then Raymond Patterson. And we were talking about, I think, I don't know if Nora was there, or Calvin wasn't there, but maybe Nora. And of course, Jane Logan Pondexter, who was a very close friend of Tom's at that point. And Tom, in his normal, serious voice, talked about the possibility of getting together. And the wonderful thing about the whole place was it was a very comfortable place. There are only two things you could do. You could go to the living room was the room that everybody Tom lived in, and then there was a kitchen which you could eat, and there was a bathroom which you could share. So it was just essential, like a submarine. Everything was very, very tight. So whenever you had an argument at these meetings, you could never really leave the argument. It was a sort of a physical environment which contained you. Everybody, when they talked about stuff, they had an opinion, was on lockdown. They were locked down in that situation, and they had to fight the issues out. So that it was a very important space, because I think that everyone knew at that time. Some worked, some didn't work. Everyone knew at that time that on Fridays, there was a place that you could come and you could drink wine from a big gallon jug, and you could talk about things that you were writing. So it became a natural magnet for all of displaced people, especially the young black writers who had a lot to say. Now, in this group, the point of development was, it was uneven. I think that both Tom and Calvin, and remarkably for his age at that time, David, were very developed writers. They were writers who had a vision of the culture. Much of it inspired, I think, influences that came from people, I would say, Hughes. His hand is there. His hand is there. They had mastered a kind of colloquial rhythm, which was not in any way slick or glossy or stylized. It was coming from the what they were working and fashion it into not so much a tool or instrument, but more or less a weapon. The weapon was not directed toward any kind of a white target. The primary focus of the weapon was to go inside and destroy that part of them as artists which was weak and that could not accept the harshness, the cruelty of the society, and they had to burn out all of that weakness. So therefore, it was a process of forging themselves into strong individuals, so that the writing of that period comes out in a way which has a kind of, how should I say, a quiet kind of anguish. For example, in Tom's poem, the figurine of dreams and sometimes nightmares, that section of the first issue poem, Tom Dent writes a poem about night dreams, black. Being beat down, I would fly away on wings of a hawk to Burma or Peru or 141st Street, where black memories lie on float, ascending like soft cigarette smoke. Memories float, their persistence terrorized me like a winging tiger clawing at the cage of my mask. Were I a tiger, were I ever a tiger, were I to reject tigerness, would I cry a tiger roar? Were I a tiger roar, a cry against my cage, cage my tiger. Gloria was my son, would I forget that? What was my child in growing? You tell me that Harlem is jazz, black suit-suited women with long dangling dicks that eat garbage and talk rhythm. You tell me that black shines in the silly masturbating dreams of some wet sheeted night. Oh, turn away, I've seen a narcotic wave, this strange float of 1,000 street corners of my generation, and now the leaves extending into the trickling, lazy flow to the cold pavement where leaping roaches and muffled cries lie. Your nakedness is my picnic. Cat peeing, wiggle me out, my apple of love, too tough to mount, trees blown away, tears washed away, dreams terrorized away. Then my child is the youngness of me, and you which add to nothing and nothing, and equals hot nights, freezing colder. The still girl, her head shoved into the toilet bowl, remains silently fixed in the picture of our love moments, central to our love moments, inextricable. Was her scream drowned by our own loving, perhaps? Perhaps she was already cold. Sweetburger, hollow lover, Sweetburger, knifing the heart of the loved ones, knifing the heart of the chosen, as always. That kind of intensity it's not a mask, it's not a pretense, it's something which is flowing from the very inner part of his writing. And that was the kind of writing that this workshop pushed into doing. The reason why I say pushed into doing it is because it wasn't a foot race. It was an attempt to find an acceptance which was not based on agreement, but acceptance that would come in the form of people saying, you're there, you hit it. And to do that required that the work have a certain energy and honesty. It had a form of people demographically probably fit in terms of the black population, all of the classes, all of the groups, they were there. So any kind of falseness would be soon blown away. There was no place. Your whole card would always be peaked. The meetings were the form in which I think, for me, was a place to see my isolation from that culture which I was a part of. It was that objective distance when I heard the pain, when I saw the possibilities of the pain. I saw there was a possibility of a remedy, not a cure, but a remedy, a means in which a person could find, in the context of writing, of art, a place to ease some suffering. Not to eradicate, but to ease some suffering. There was a comradeship, because there was an agreement, although it wasn't really spoken out, that existed between the people in Umber, that that didn't prove entirely true. Because what happens is that when you're in this kind of debate, there are bound to these schisms, fractures, and all kinds of visions of what the group should be. And it's the very place where this kind of ideological ferment should start. And it begins there. It begins because it's a definition of African American art which is being formed in terms of one road which is taking a very strident nationalistic point of view, and another group that's saying that within the context of America there is a place for my art, although I have misgivings about America, but there's a place for my art which is not isolated artistically in terms of the standards, not isolated in terms of what it means and it can be to other people. So therefore these schisms, these groups, these clashes were underway. For those who probably some of the things talk about the history of how we're ended, but I'm not of the opinion that Humber ever ended. I'm saying that there were serious differences that appeared over art and ideology. But the art, of course, was there was I think David probably has some strong feelings about this, about the groups that formed. One was more or less, it was over the poem that was about, had a lot of the assassination of President Kennedy, whether or not it should be published or shouldn't be published. The editors thought that maybe in good taste that we might move away from that. Within that group there was a certain faction that said, no, let it fall where it may. And as a result, that was, it tended to be a very divisive point in the history book. Because at that point, the line was drawn between those who were nationalistic, cultural nationalistic, which was the poem later, and those who were poets who thought that, hey, we can't say that the world is all black. And in doing so, that would impose certain limits. Now, these were necessary tendencies within the movement of art, especially black art during that period, because they helped define the dimensions and the direction of where the art was to go. It was absolutely necessary for this disagreement to occur. But in the midst of that disagreement, there was never really a kind of a serious leaning away of a love of the culture from which the art was inspired. No one ever deserted that idea. And although you have a tremendous range in terms of the writers, in terms of what they took up, I mean, in terms of a focus, some of the writers were to go with Mary Baraka's form of black artist movement, or work with Skirma Touré, Charles and Neil Patterson. These were some of the writers who had creative and minority differences with the poet. But they never left with some arguments unresolved, but they never left in terms of being